Hobbits, a Boise Bros production. Last time that we got together, we were talking about all the different creatures of both Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. In that discussion, we kind of came across a few different creatures that actually had enough sentience that they had their own kind of culture to them. So I decided that this week we would talk about races and different cultures associated with those races. So with that being said, this one's going to be a little bit more of a Game of Thrones heavy one because there are so many different cultures throughout the world of Thrones, whereas Lord of the Rings has basically all of the dwarves, elves, orcs, stuff like that. Stuff most of us know, but we will discuss that at length. So, where shall we start, boys?
Well, if we're going to start with Game of Thrones, let's start with what everyone kind of knows. We'll start with the Northerners and we'll work our way south, just like the show did. Yeah.
So with the Northerners, basically they pride themselves on being descendants of the First Men, the ones who came across the land bridge that was at the bottom of Westeros in Dorne. And they came across that land bridge, and basically they started attacking the Children of the Forest, and there was this whole big war between them. They were burning down the weirwood trees, and the Children of the Forest didn't know how to act. It is said that through their own magics, the Children of the Forest broke the arm of Dorne, and that's why Dorne and Essos are no longer connected at all. And then through that, and then as the war just kind of raged northward along Westeros, they also flooded the area that became the neck of Westeros. And so eventually you have the Pact, and the First Men eventually start adopting the worship of the old gods, as well as the children of the forest.
Which tames the war and kind of makes it they came to an agreement.
And within the show, you can imply that sometime in there was the creation of the White Walkers that the Children of the Forest used as the weapon to try and fight back against the First Men, and then in that they created their own Frankenstein's monster, and they had to ally with the First Men to eventually stop the White Walkers and all that good stuff. So with the Northerners, they really pride themselves on being the descendants of these First Men because they basically, nobody besides Targaryens have ever been able to conquer the Northern Kingdom, and even then, Targaryens didn't even have to come north. You had the story of Torrhen Stark, who bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen and just basically put himself into the Seven Kingdoms. But in that, you had a smart move on his part because then his entire culture, his entire lineage wasn't destroyed.
Yeah, it was saved because of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have this huge lineage there. And it's not to say that they're of a different racial type than, say, so we're going to get into the Andals, which were the next big group of men who came to Westeros. And so they were born in the hills of Andalos, is what it was said. And they had a vision of their god of the seven, the seven-pointed star, all this good stuff. And they started carving the seven-pointed star into their foreheads and on their sails, and they eventually sailed across the narrow sea and started invading Westeros and killing First Men and Children of the Forest, if there were any still in the south.
It was like a crusade.
Yeah, basically.
The easiest way to look at it is it's like the Catholic crusade. They came over, they were trying to convert people or kill them. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting there. It's just... It's very cool to know, obviously the northern people were those last First Men holdouts up in the north, and then basically everybody down south kind of became the Andals, or would intermingle with some of the First Men that they didn't kill, I'm sure, but the majority of the religion of the Andals became the majority religion in the south. And that's why you have so much of Game of Thrones is devoted around the faith of the Seven.
So a question, can all of the houses of the modern period of Game of Thrones within the show, for example, trace their origins back to the First Men?
So that's actually really one of the cool things is that, a lot of them can trace themselves back to, and they talk about the Age of Heroes, where they have certain heroic figures who were of a certain race, like the First Men or of the Andals, and they can trace themselves back to that. With the Lannister house, you have their founding was apparently Lan the Clever, who swindled House Casterly out of their ancestral home, which was Casterly Rock. And so...
and that's where they now find their current home in the Lannister.
Is what they talk about. And then there was an Andal commander who was a certain Aaron was his last name, and he basically founded what would become Jon Arryn's house and Lysa Arryn, which Alex has finally started watching the show. So
Episode 6.
So he's actually starting to get a little bit more of this. So it's kind of cool.
It's really fun.
But most of them can trace their lineage back to one of these two things. And then in the case of Dorne, one more race of people that did come to Westeros was the Rhoynar. And so on Essos, there's the Rhoyne River, and the Rhoynar were these people who basically worshipped at the Rhoyne. They prayed to the Rhoyne. There was some water god of some sort that they believed in.
Right.
And then they fell on hard times, and they were led by Nymeria, was her name. And she led them on the 10,000 ships or something, and she tried to take them to Sithorios. There was this whole thing there where when she tried to settle there, that was when the Roanoke incident happened, and it just didn't work out for them, unfortunately. So after their failure to settle in Yin, Nymeria eventually led her people to Dorne, and once they got to Westeros, if I recall in the lore, she set fire to all the ships, and she basically said, we're not going anywhere else.
Right.
And then Nymeria eventually married into Dornish royalty, and then, if I recall, she was actually what started their whole thing of being willing to have a princess of Dorne be their leader.
I don't... Nymeria, that's the name of Arya's...
Yes. So
direwolf, that's cool.
No, that's where that story comes from. Is that that's a person in legend that Arya looks up to, and it's very cool. So all throughout Westeros, you basically have these three different people groups, and then obviously they kind of turn into their own thing. And then some things like with the Dornish, it's almost like because their home kind of became that thing to them, and then. I don't know if the show implies it that the Rhoynar are the reason that the Dornish are of this olive-skinned.
The show,
or if it's just because that's the climate they lived in.
Casting-wise, they definitely took. It seems like they took some people from different races.
Yeah,
everyone looks like they're part of the same race. It's kind of Indian.
Yeah,
a little bit.
I always took it as kind of like Indian, a little bit of Spanish.
Yeah, but. Yeah, so the show kind of delves into that, but they definitely don't talk about it. No, the books go over the history of it. The show literally just has it to be introducing a new faction.
And with that, it's so interesting because the only real racism I see just on Westeros itself is literally just people think the Dornish are crazy. They just stay away from Dornish.
Yeah,
people.
So the Dornish people in Game of Thrones, they're definitely more open to everything. They're like the hippies, if you would.
Because Oberyn Martell kind of comes into the picture, and he's just this guy who just wants to have sex with everything and everyone.
It's not only sex though. He just enjoys experiences. So he's all about sex, food, wine, the world,
culture,
everything. He's a very cultured man, and he wants to experience everything so that way he can.
And he's one of the few, and just the fact that he's not the firstborn in his family. His brother's in a wheelchair, so. He's the leader of Dorne at the time, and obviously they swear allegiance to the crown in King's Landing. But because he's the second brother and he doesn't have any responsibilities, but he's also rich, he just goes and he explores the world. And he learns all this stuff over in Essos, and he spends years fighting in the fighting pits at some point.
Just for fun.
He
just enjoyed it.
So... but Westeros already is just its own mishmash of all these different cultures kind of coming together. It used to be, before the Seven Kingdoms was founded, that all of these kingdoms kind of just grew up out of the Andals, the first men, Rhoynar, whenever they came over. and they just kind of stayed separately. They were always warring with each other. The Riverlands was just always, and it's considered the 8th kingdom,
right,
because it's not really part of any normal kingdom, and it's just always getting trod upon by whoever's warring between them, because it's like right here in between, like the north, which is up here, over here's the Vale of Arryn, you got the Westerlands with Casterly Rock, you've got the Stormlands down here, and then occasionally you have the Iron Islands. They come in and they want to raid and steal everybody's stuff, and they're
essentially pirates.
Yeah. So the whole thing with Greyjoys is like their whole house words is "we do not sow," and that's just to say we will never sow the fields. We will always pillage and raid people for our supplies. Like that's how they operate.
Right.
So before that, you just had these singular kingdoms that were always trying to keep their own sovereignty together. And then you have the influence of the Targaryens as they finally come over from...
Now, Targaryens, and this is a question I have, and let me know if this is wrong,
yes,
but they can't trace their origins back to the first man.
So no, so that's a completely different thing. So Targaryens are descendants of Valyrians.
Right.
And Valyrians used to be a bunch of shepherds, basically, in what was old Valyria. And then they happened, and I want to say it was like the Seven Flames or something, were the volcanoes of their area that they went and found the dragon eggs in. And once they started hatching these dragons, they started becoming these great warriors, and they built these great civilizations.
And it's also supposed to be a lot of magic in their time. So not only, yes, they started out as shepherds. Something happened, and it was supposed to be some global event to where they not only found dragon eggs, they also somehow discovered magic, and they built their society through these advancements.
Well, and it can be implied that because of their ability to tame these dragons, that also kind of inherently gave them more magical ability, because dragons inherently
are magical,
bring magic,
make the world more magical.
Exactly.
They just influence the world of Game of Thrones in such a way that you can't really see all the effects it has, but those who are in tune with it, within magic, they're like, oh, yeah.
But so Valyria is let's go across the Narrow Sea into Essos, and what was once a great civilization. Basically, Rome is what Valyria was. It had roads, it had high towers. You see artist interpretations of what old Valyria used to look like, and it's just so much more grandiose than what Westeros is at the time.
Like a higher society.
Basically a higher society, absolutely.
Think of it like a society that was generations more advanced than anything else in the world. And when it crumbled, all that knowledge was lost.
And there was this whole doom of Valyria, and nobody knows exactly what happened, whether it was that all the volcanoes exploded or just something happened. But when you look at the maps of current Valyria, it's just completely ripped asunder. There's just giant areas where the landmass either sank or is just gone.
It's kind of like an Atlantis story.
It's very much an Atlantis story for that.
And there's a lot of theories that actually are like they used their magic too much, or they relied on it too much, and then when
they
magic
dug too deep.
Well, yes,
dug too deep, found something dark. I just want to cover a couple of those theories. So one was that they built their civilization off of slaves. And we'll get to another city/culture that came from this. But you had all these slaves who were working in the mines underneath Valyria. And out of these slaves was said to have been the first faceless man. And basically he offered to give death to, any of the slaves who just couldn't deal with the hardships anymore. Basically give the death of the faceless god to these people. And then out of that, at some point, they think that maybe something to do with the faceless men helped cause the doom, and that's why Valyria fell. There is also, like what Ryan just said, they were always causing all these... they were doing these blood magic rituals. Dark magic. They had penal colonies off on some of the Summer Isles, or Basilisk Isles is where they were. And in one of their pits, basically, they were doing all these different blood magics and combining men with other creatures. Oh. And the thought is that maybe the gods were so disgusted by this that they finally just decided, you know what, it's time, we got to destroy this. So very much like Atlantis on that one, where it's just getting to the point where the gods just can't deal with this any longer.
The civilization that was against them or whatever.
And so, there was that. And we don't fully know, and that's just speculation on their part. But the thing about it was, so then you have the Targaryens, which they were just a family of Valyrians. They weren't actually just like... They were Valyrians, but they weren't like all of Valyria. They were just a family within it.
Now, Valyria is a place or a name or a house?
Valyria is a place.
Okay.
Rather.
And so there were
the people of it were Valyrians, and then there were houses.
So like the northern men, like the...
So basically like with the first men, you have House Stark, you have Karstark, you have Bolton, you have Mormont. All these people can trace their lineage back to first men, basically. But they are their own houses. They have their own family lineage.
As they've kind of come
So Valyrians are the people, but then you had other houses within, and we don't really have a lot of information about those other houses, but the one we care about is House Targaryen.
Because they did so much when Valyria disappeared, fell.
So what happened is, one of the family members at the time, her name was Aenys Targaryen, and she was Aenys the Dreamer. And she had a prophetic dream about the fall of Valyria. So she convinced her family, or whoever the head of her family was, that we should move to our little abode on Dragonstone, which is a little island just off the coast of Westeros. And so that's where they went, and that they apparently went there about 100 years before Aegon Targaryen would eventually start his reign. But the doom of Valyria happens.
So the Targaryens were essentially the family that survived Valyria falling, because they chose to leave Valyria. Everyone else was like, why would you leave? It's an amazing place.
And they just
were more advanced than everyone else.
Outcasts.
Yeah, so they left. Everyone in Valyria kind of shunned them, because they decided to leave their culture, and then they survived because they
So what's in Valyria now? Just curious.
Like it's basically it's this place where they send. There's this horrible sickness called grayscale in the show, and it's basically kind of like leprosy, but even worse because it really affects your mind, and eventually you lose your humanity as a result of it. But like most people just send people with grayscale to die there, essentially. And then there's other things where people say they get cursed when they go by. It's just this forsaken wasteland, essentially.
It's kind of like a place where like a nuke has been dropped. Like you just don't go there.
Yeah, it's like there's this fallout that almost keeps you there. There's multiple times where in season 2 of Game of Thrones, Jorah meets a person she's drawing all these, markings on somebody, and she just explains, anybody who has to go near Valyria needs certain kind of special protection from whatever lies there. And there's just awful, awful things that happen to people who sail into Valyria.
It's almost like the Bermuda Triangle, where no one knows why it's messed up, but everyone is afraid of it.
Everyone knows the rumors of cool.
Yeah. Cool.
And nobody knows the full truth, but there's always these rumors and things.
So in Origin, you have the First Men, you have the Valyrians. Are those the two groups, or is there another?
Well, so like I said, First Men, Andals, Rhoynar. Rhoynar stemmed from Essos, eventually left to come to Westeros, intermingled and yada yada, all those kingdoms. You got Valyrians. Now, from the Valyrian slaves, you have this people group that kind of comes up and they escape and they head up into this area of northwestern Essos, and they found the city of Bravos, but it's a hidden city. And nobody knows about it, and they basically just kind of build up this culture there. And like the way that it works is just they have this natural defense where the only way to get into Bravos is through one channel from the ocean. And so they built up their city inside, and then they just kind of expanded, built their economy up, and then eventually they had this coming out day, essentially is what they called it, where they showed themselves to the world and at this time Valyria was still a thing. And
so many slaves escaped?
Yeah.
Or all of them?
No, just like so many slaves.
A society enough.
Enough of these people eventually became this people group that started the city of Bravos.
Okay.
And you have a bunch of these other free cities that sprouted up around this time, and the point of them being free cities is that they were on their own. They weren't part of Valyria. They weren't under the subjugation of Valyria, but they would work for Valyria.
Gotcha. And now that Valyria is gone, they're kind of
they just kind of do their own thing.
And they're just called the city of
so you have Bravos, and you have a bunch of the other free cities. You got Korhor, Volantis was one of them.
Yeah, they're essentially cities that are disconnected from.
They're not a people. They're just
I'm just saying that was the kind of an offshoot there, and it's really unique. At some point, if we wanted to, we could talk about each of those cities. I'm not going to go into that too much today.
This isn't a geography episode.
No. And then, so another big people group you have are the Dothraki.
Yes, the Horse Lords.
And you've started to understand a little bit about the Dothraki.
They're cool.
With all their calls and everything. And so the thing you need to understand, I don't know if you got this, is that Khal Drogo is just a leader of just one portion of Dothraki.
Yeah.
They follow his strength, whereas, there's a bunch of other calls, and they all come together.
Right. Because some of the nobles in, I think it's King's Landing, right? They were talking about the Dothraki. He's like, oh, she's wedded a horse lord. So I'm assuming there are other horse lords. Maybe they're Dothraki, maybe they're other things.
They're Dothraki.
All Dothraki. So he has a very large group.
The only people that are not Dothraki, like within these hordes that they travel around, are basically the slaves that they take from conquered cities.
Right.
But like most Dothraki are the ones riding on the horses, following their call.
Yeah, they don't have money. They just trade. They have slave.
Like they take money for their own purposes if they so desire, but it's not part of their culture. They don't really need.
They have a traveling culture essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're like they're a culture where they never settle down, and they're just roamers.
They're kind of like the Plains Native Americans.
But they do have something of like a central city that they've actually gone to.
So the whole point about that is, so you have Vaes Dothrak, which is their place of worship. It's their main area. It's their holy city. And every once in a while, they have this great call meeting, basically. I forget what the actual term was that they used in the show. But they have this great meeting where all the calls get together. And when you go into the city, you are not allowed to spill blood at all.
Yes.
Which you learned firsthand that there was a way to get around that by boiling a man's head with gold.
Loved that moment.
So
did not like him.
Did not like Viserys Targaryen. Had it coming.
Question that is completely unrelated to this, but I am curious. So Targaryens can't burn in the show, right? That's like the whole thing.
Specifically, Daenerys can't burn because
they're related.
Because also Viserys did burn.
Right.
Like we're really thinking about it.
Right. So I'm like.
And then you have Jaehaerys Targaryen, if I recall, was the one who did this whole ritual trying to bring a stone egg back from the dead, and he had wildfire involved, and it burned down the Targaryen hold of Summerhall, which was in Westeros.
Okay, so this is...
And he didn't survive.
Okay, so this is a Daenerys...
Specifically, it's a Daenerys thing.
So it's not all Targaryens are fireproof.
From what I remember in anything else from the book, besides, obviously, we've already talked about it, the magic of the birthing of her dragons was the main reason that she survived the fires in the books.
Something where the dragons gave her magic.
Was there any other mention of any other Valyrians ever having that ability?
None. They tamed dragons, so you could assume that they had some type of fireproof to tame them, but there's nothing besides speculation.
Yeah.
So
if any of that was ever recorded or talked about, it was most likely a magical event in relation to dragons.
Gotcha.
Most of the time, no. In the show, Daenerys is always fireproof, legitimately always.
I thought that plot point in that moment was that he wasn't actually her brother, or he wasn't actually.
No, he was her brother. He was straight up her brother.
Yeah, she's just supposed to be special.
Okay,
She's just a
special gal.
Yep. Cool. So
Horse lords you were talking about.
Still on the Dothraki. They're very interesting in just obviously the fact that they are just a warring kind of, like I said, kind of based off Native Americans, and Mongols.
Yes.
Mongolians.
Warring nation that travels.
Warring nation.
In nature.
And you have so many stories of just cities that when they see a Dothraki horde coming, they either decide that it's time to give them a sacrifice or we're going to stand and fight. So they either give them slaves or, whatever. Yeah. And there's a bunch of stories about, if a Khal didn't like the look of the slaves, like the women he took, if he thought all of the women were too ugly, he just decided it was time to sack the city.
Right.
Or he was just like, it's been a while since we've had a good fight. Let's practice.
Very temperamental, barbaric.
Very temperamental.
But very, very, I wouldn't say, maybe it's a cultural thing, but they're very religious. They're very set. And there was a spot where two of them were like watching, I think, Daenerys, and they were like talking about the moon and how the moon is sisters.
They had a lot of different beliefs.
It is known,
they
right?
Had a lot of beliefs.
Like, they're very set in those. And it seems like that's kind of their culture.
And see, with with those women, I'm not sure if it is known thing, because some of those women that you see with Daenerys there are just slave women that have been taken.
So they might not actually be.
So they might not actually be Dothraki.
But they do have beliefs, as far as like eating the heart and finishing
yes,
that, right?
Yes.
Horses will not, go on water that they can't drink, right?
Yeah.
So there are some things that are very like, this is our culture, this is our beliefs, and they will not change.
Exactly.
Right.
So they're very set in stone on that.
Yeah.
And they're kind of very honor bound. You have with the calls, you have their blood riders essentially, and their whole thing with the blood riders is when a call dies, the blood riders are actually supposed to go with them. And they're supposed to basically die themselves because they go into the afterlife with the call, and they, ride into the great stallion area and whatever.
Yeah, I'm excited to see more of them because we're literally just in the phase where he's like running around, and you showed me the map of like what Khal Drogo's movements were from like when they became Daenerys' army to over here.
Yeah, I had to give Alex context for why Viserys was being such a pain about like Khal Drogo going where he was going, because you essentially start, where it's just the narrow sea stopping you from going over to Westeros, and he's literally going all the way across Essos and taking his army the wrong way, so to speak.
It's so funny.
And it's just
I'm
funny.
like, I get it, but it's also like, what are you gonna do?
Yeah. So yeah, they're very superstitious. You talk about the Dothraki, they will not attack things unless their omens favor war.
Yeah.
All these other things.
Yeah.
They warred with another race of people I just wanted to mention that existed, and they were called the Sarnori or the Tolmen. There was once a great kingdom of Sarnor in the northern portion of Essos. And they were a great warrior nation that just warred with the Dothraki, and they were eventually brought to ruin. Their kingdoms basically nothing. There's only about 20,000 of their people left, and who knows if they're ever going to rebuild that, and obviously that's not something that's focused upon. And as you get further east, you get into some more crazy races, and not crazy, but just like out there.
Very different
from what the Westerosi are. You have the people of Yeti, which is basically what imperialist China would be, where it's said that the Emperor of Yeti lives in a palace that is the size of King's Landing itself. Like, just his palace.
We've never been there.
No, we've never been there.
No, and it's more folklore. Like, you learn
folklore.
Rumors. Yeah, we never see them, meet them.
Yeah, there's continents we haven't seen.
Yeah,
right?
yep. With their culture, there's a fascinating story that it is possible. So you have the Long Night, which is what the White Walkers brought about, and that's you have the full battle with them, and you have the building of the wall.
Winter is coming.
But so because the world of Ice and Fire is round, there's also something that's similar to the walls on the far side of Yeti. That's similar to the wall, on the far side of Yeti, and it's called the Five Forts. And basically, it defends from something that's off in the far wastes of something beyond that. And so some people speculate that the way that the Land of Always Winter up past the wall can come back and like connect here. And so, because both Yeti and people of Ashai and Westeros have these legends about the Long Night, it is possible that, they both were dealing with this White Walker threat in their own way. And so you had the Dothraki, they were talking about how Jorah told Daenerys the story about how they believe, there's this great white grass of some kind, ghost grass that'll come from over yonder and it'll destroy the world. And,
that's how the world ends in their
in their religion. And it almost, in the way that it's talked about, it almost seems like it could be implied that that's the White Walkers
themselves being
the White Walkers themselves coming and destroying all light and life.
Yeah, it'd be interesting though, because like if you're going to the other side, I would imagine it wouldn't be the same climate.
No, not at all.
So they could be dealing with ice zombies over in the Westeros side, and they could be like
some other kind of zombies,
like sand zombies.
Because it's supposed to be like
desert.
a great.
Yeah, it's supposed to be
a great desert past the Five Forts.
So it could be like a desert zombie,
very
classic Egyptian mummy stuff.
Yeah.
But so with Yeti, and this is why I was bringing it up, they have legends in their culture of they were once ruled by this great god emperor, is what they called him, and he reigned for 10,000 years, and then eventually he ascended to the heavens, and every emperor after him became like the Topaz Emperor, the Tourmaline Emperor, the Opal Emperor, and they just kind of were descending, and every single one of them, as their reigns go, it seems like they're getting less and less good or great.
Yeah, they start with really fancy jewels or precious metals or something.
And then I can't remember, they get to I think it was the Amethyst Empress was the one who got usurped by her half-brother or her brother, and he dubbed himself the Bloodstone Emperor. And it's said that he worshipped, a black stone that fell from the sky. And this is where we kind of get back into that Cthulhu thing. And he started making these sacrifices. And some people think that it was his actions that caused the long night. Oh. So that him dabbling in all these...
This is Yeti folklore. This is
Yeti folklore. And I just wanted to get into this because this is a different people group that is out there in the world that we somewhat know about.
So I want to talk about... I think wildlings are pretty quick.
Yeah, wildlings are pretty quick because they're basically part of the First Men as well. They just ended up kind of on the wrong side of the wall when things happen.
Yeah, they chose to not have the kind of hierarchy. They didn't want the royalty.
They didn't want
life.
King. Anarchists.
Yeah, well, no. Yeah, essentially,
semi.
They didn't want to live in an imperial world, so they chose to have a free world on the other side of the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because Tyrion talks about it really early on, where he's like, we should be so glad that we were the ones born on this side of the wall and they were born on that, because look at how different life has become. Right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty much.
And you get to see that a little bit more as you go into the show as well. Are you really glad that you're on that side of the wall? Besides the White Walkers, free folk life seems kind of nice sometimes.
Yeah, they just chill out.
I'm not going to spoil any more for you, but there's some stuff that happens where you kind of see this life is kind of...
To be fair, the very earliest, the first episode where I'm introduced with the wildlings and I see what happens, I'm I don't like where they live. And then the girl just standing there with the eyes, and I'm like, oh no. It was great scene, but it made me push away from the wildlings.
Besides the White Walkers' presence up there, living up north, besides that and snow, if I could live in the winter, which...
Benjen likes it. Being a ranger and going out, right?
But he was a northerner too,
right.
So
he was used to the snow.
He was so used because in summer for the people of the north, they get snow quite often.
Yeah.
You saw Maester Pycelle saying on these warm summer days I envy your summer snows.
Right.
So they kind of get used to that.
You think you envy them until you go and experience one.
Before we start talking about some Lord of the Rings related races and just kind of delving into discussion about their cultures, there was one race of people that I found that was actually very similar to dwarves, and it was the people of Ib. And that's why I told you when I was showing you the map.
Right.
You said,
you want to talk about...
There's this island up here. Well, what's about that?
Let's talk about that.
So Ib, these people are kind of like dwarves. Almost. They're short, stout people, very strong, and they can't they can't breed with humans. They're literally...
a very different
type of race.
Yeah, okay.
Essentially. And on their island, there is actually a offshoot of what we could assume is the Children of the Forest, which are called the Ifaquevron. And they're basically the same thing. Yeah. Is that they're these small, childlike creatures that live in the forests and bless people who are kind to them if they ever see them, or they bless certain households. And so that was just a very interesting thing, is that he does have a dwarven-like race. The only thing that even comes close to elves would kind of just be the Valyrians at the height of their power.
Right. Yeah.
But they're worse because they, have slaves, and, their empire is just built on all these other awful things.
So the Children of the Forest, though, as far as Westeros goes, do they find themselves... I know they're not around anymore.
They're not around.
But were they on the other side of the wall?
We don't know.
Basically...
They're just an ancient enough civilization that
Yes.
there's not that much info on them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can they breed with people?
No idea.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's not touched on.
I'm just curious, because I know sometimes you have strange characters that'll
However, I will say this. You can't imply that they were able to intermingle with people like that, but you have wargs, you have people with that kind of ability who maybe that came from something to do with that, or if it was literally just like an inherent magical ability from something. Yeah. So, just to kind of answer your question, it's unknown, but that could be implied that that's maybe a reason why wargs exist.
And are they immortal? We don't
know. It's implied in the show that they are. I don't believe they are in the books.
We've never seen any... It's implied that they live a really long time.
They live a long time, but I wouldn't say they're immortal.
Because I know there's one episode, and this is in a couple seasons I'm excited for, because there is a child of the forest that pops up, and there's a cave thing, and they're throwing magical stones or something. I've seen scenes. And I'm like, I don't know, when I was looking through all the races and cultures, that one was the most interesting because it's a lost culture. And I always think those are kind of the coolest to explore.
So, and in the show, one of those ones that's there... It shows her present when the Night King is created. And so that was, 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So you could say they're immortal or just have a really, really long lifespan. But we don't know exactly.
We don't know
enough. You don't know if they're actually immortal or not because if they were immortal in the general sense, the whole war with the first men... would have been much different.
Well,
if
they
were
could
immortal.
be killed by combat, right?
Well, yeah,
elves are immortal.
Because immortality is not the same as being impervious. It's not like they can't be killed. Elves can be killed.
But they could have just waited out the men. In a way.
They could have.
Unless more generations
it's
kept
just
coming.
Constantly. Because the other thing about it is so they live in the forest.
Yeah.
And if the men are just burning the forest as they go,
that's my house, man.
That's my gods, man. I've been drawing faces on there so I can talk to my gods.
How old are you? 27? I've been here 9,000 years, bro. Get out.
Yeah.
Who do you think you are?
I don't know. It would be interesting, depending on how powerful they really were, if they were having trouble with just basic humans.
Right.
How, what level?
Well, yeah, I think what we've seen, they're magical, right?
Yeah.
Are they fighters? They're children looking.
The one thing that you saw with them throwing their magical fireballs is about the most we get from their fighting prowess. One of them shoots a bow and arrow,
They don't seem to be anything
They're
super
not
special.
like a super powerful race when it comes to military might. But when it comes to their magical ability, like I said, it is implied that they broke the arm of Dorne to make sure no more men were crossing. They tried to flood this whole area right below the north to keep people from coming through, and that's why you have this really marshy area.
I was just trying to figure out what race, if we were to directly compare the two, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, which matches with, you have Ib with the dwarves.
He does a really good job, honestly, of differentiating his different races, because I like that he doesn't have your stereotypical, you have dwarves and that's what they're called, you have elves and that's what they're called. No, he just kind of makes his own different people groups, and they have their things that make them special, and then you occasionally have a couple of offshoots of humanoids. Because then you also have the brindled men down in Sithorios, and they're not able to. They're the same as the ones in Ib, where they can't reproduce with normal humans. But they've learned enough of the human speech that they can trade with them whenever there are traders who come by and stuff like that. But you never see something quite like that in Tolkien's work.
No, not so much. So I don't know. I think I was trying to find parallels, and I didn't know where to put the Children of the Forest.
This one's a little bit harder to find
because I was hobbits, but then lifespan elves, but magic.
Yeah. So I think Tolkien's world is different enough to where it's very hard to make a comparison between.
And I don't really think which is in Game of Thrones really.
No, not really. Unless you consider the White Walkers themselves to be basically the orcs, which I don't, because they're inherently a completely different being. and they have completely different powers and fighting capabilities.
And mental capacity.
Because
they're not...
Yeah, orcs are meant... Well, so the White Walkers themselves are kind of alive, whereas their whites, their zombies, are not.
It's easier to make a comparison with Lord of the Rings to like Norse mythology, with like elves, dark elves, dwarves, humans.
Yeah.
So I think you got to give Martin props for really making his own.
Yeah.
No, it's
pretty
very
original.
cool because you see a lot of different fantasy series that kind of just take the elf or dwarf archetype and they twist it a little bit. They make elves more fair, or they make them short. Like that was always the weirdest thing for me when I did get into Lord of the Rings. Is you always heard about Santa Claus and his elves were like tiny people,
right?
And it was like, why did we take elves and dwarves and combine them for the Santa Claus mythos?
Yeah.
So when I saw Lord of the Rings, and elves are these tall, fair, really just regal beings.
Yeah,
right.
definitely more Norse like elves.
Yeah.
Because they're meant to be more magical and enchanting.
And I feel like a lot of the culture of Game of Thrones really, when it comes down to like the races, I don't know if it's so much the race of men versus like the houses of men. Like that's where you find the biggest differences in setting themselves apart from each other.
Just have. You have basically like nationalism almost happening there, where you're loyal to the family that is part of like your nation or what used to be your nation. Yeah. And that's why Aegon, the way he did it when he conquered the Seven Kingdoms, he just basically made someone the Lord of the North or the Lord of the Vale or things like that. He had these people who were loyal to him that then keep everybody in check. And all throughout the histories of Westeros, you have these times in Westeros history where a certain Lord of the North or some Warden of the North, that's the word I was looking for, is not very loyal to the crown or the throne.
Right.
And so they start having these things. And Dorne itself, this is very interesting, Dorne itself didn't actually join the Seven Kingdoms until way after Aegon was dead. They actually married into the Targaryens, and that through that marriage they were able to come in, and that's when the Seven Kingdoms were finally made the Seven Kingdoms. So you'll find out more about that as you go, but
I'm pumped for it.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, and then when you jump over to Lord of the Rings, you have these races who you really don't see too much infighting within a race. It's almost like a house, really. You have the House of Elves, the House of men are pretty fickle.
Men are a little bit more fickle because
territorial, whatever.
They're territorial. They're petty in some cases. There's obviously the scene where Aragorn is telling Theoden to call for aid when they're at Helm's Deep,
right?
And he just says, where was Gondor when all of these things were happening to us?
Pride really gets in the way.
We aren't like the elves or the dwarves or like you, Aragorn. We don't have these great alliances where we're able to just call on somebody for aid.
It's a fight, and it's not even the fight we're trying to have.
Exactly.
It's we can do this ourselves.
We are alone,
right?
The only thing that's interesting there is, so when it comes to the men, you do have different types of men who are more willing to slide to either the good or the evil side. You have the Easterlings, you have the Haradrim, and you have the Corsairs of Umbar, which, if I recall, some of these were Dark Númenóreans who came from Númenor, and they were obviously swayed to evil.
Yeah, I also think that you maybe you have. As well as these different types of men, you also have the classes of men. That's also very prevalent in both series. But it's not as much of I'm more royal than you, which is Game of Thrones a lot.
Yes.
Man, you guys are Starks and you guys are the Knights in the North, but we're the Baratheons, we're the land, we're so proud. Where it's in Lord of the Rings, it's more, Gondor is its kingdom, you have the levels, the peasants, the fighters, the leadership, so on and so forth.
And you're actually of this bloodline, okay, well you're destined to be the king of this place. And obviously the only thing you have that's really stopping that is, Denethor obviously doesn't want the king to return.
Yeah.
And so he's, clashing with Gandalf over, Aragorn and stuff. And I won't bow to this ranger from the north.
Yeah.
yada yada.
And that nationalism you talked about in the houses of Game of Thrones, it's kind of harder in Lord of the Rings because you really have that one common enemy in Sauron.
Because that's the thing, is anybody who's working with Sauron is basically the enemy, and then anybody who's trying to work, and just with a little bit of hatred between the races, or just like,
we don't need help.
Because elves look down on men because out of men came Isildur, and Isildur basically could have destroyed Sauron, but he didn't, and so you kind of look down on him as just weak and and then dwarves and elves are just kind of always button heads, where dwarves are just these great warriors and craftsmen, and elves are great warriors, but they really just want to appreciate the world.
One's more nature-based, the other is more material-based.
Yeah, they're searching for gems and diamonds. Exactly. And humans get stuck in their own conflicts of territories. And
I would honestly say it's a mix between the elves on one side that are all for nature, the dwarves that are all for wealth and greed, and then you've got humans who are younger. They're a younger race.
They have less time to live.
They all came about the same time in that world.
Okay. I guess they're just a less powerful race.
Exactly.
Where they're just taking,
because they're not inherently magical unless they go.
They don't have these great minds, these great constructs of theirs.
The only truly great civilizations of men were the people of Numenor, who eventually would found Arnor and Gondor, and then you had something about the Men of Dale, and I didn't really do much research onto them, but you had the Men of Dale, who were this really great, this great city that was destroyed by Smaug, and you had only a few descendants of those people, and it was the leader of Lake Town, or one of the leaders of Lake Town, who eventually shot the Black Arrow that brought Smaug down, and he eventually became the King of Dale because he was a descendant of that line.
Yeah, and again, this is how it happens. It's not politics.
Exactly. It's always about bloodline. You honor bloodline as best you can with only a few detractors from that, like Denethor.
Right. And that's kind of the biggest difference. I think that it's easier for cultures and races in Game of Thrones to kind of diverge, whereas in Lord of the Rings, it's kind of all set in stone.
Especially because not that I've ever read in it, Lord of the Rings doesn't ever have bastards or anything.
Not so much. No.
It seems like if there are any illegitimate children, they're never mentioned, or obviously whatever. Well, whereas with Game of Thrones,
it might be the religious aspect though, because you've got Martin, who isn't a super religious guy. Absolutely. And so his story obviously reflects that with these bastard
and obviously
children.
Tolkien
super religious.
Really wasn't interested in showing a sexual thing or anything as a repercussion of sexual stuff.
Martin's characters like to poke a whole lot more than I'd say Tolkien's, in so much of you were a Greyjoy and they're all gone now, and now you're that one instance with Tyrion's poking, right?
Well, it's almost Martin, he's making a story based on the human condition of people being inherently bad, and all these problems happen because people are bad. Whereas Tolkien, he's going through it with, if people are living a perfect life in a perfect, if they were
Hobbiton.
Well, think about it. If he's taking it as the aspect of these people are not corrupted inherently, and the corruption, aka is this Sauron and Satan and being tempted by the devil, whatever. He's showing a society that would be perfect. So there's no reason to have bastard children or anything like that, because he, in his world, he doesn't see that as something that people even attempt.
Exactly. Right. Whereas, and you'll find this out a lot more as you go through the story. Game of Thrones, it's just the culture is if a bastard is legitimized by a ruling power or something, they immediately have the rights to have these things. That's one of the biggest things about. So you obviously found a bastard of Robert Baratheon, and if he were to be legitimized, and something happens there where all of a sudden Joffrey and all these other people are no longer considered legitimate heirs to the throne.
They're younger than these,
or something that. And you'll find out more as you go.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was set straight away for me that bastards were going to be an important thing.
Exactly.
When Snow says, "What's my surname?" It's Snow, and why isn't it Snow?
No, and that's
It's true.
So once you legitimize people, it just kind of becomes this whole war of attrition about who has the greater birthright, and are you willing to go to war for your said birthright?
Yeah, so it's Yeah, it's just Game of Thrones is more politics and war through politics, whereas Lord of the Rings is good versus evil.
I just feel like I know who like the characters I'm cheering for in Lord of the Rings almost right away, with like very minor missteps of they had a moment, but now they're back on track.
Yeah.
I watched Game of Thrones, I'm like, I don't know who to trust. They're all kind of jerks to one another, but overall, like, I think I like it.
Yeah,
I'm
like,
rolling wrong.
even amongst the Starks, you feel like there's a couple of characters where you're just like, oh, I don't like the way Catelyn treats, this person. But also she has this really cool moment where, she calls on all of her banners and she kidnaps Tyrion and like, oh, that's kind of badass.
It was. Yeah, yeah. So I feel like I'm much more on the edge of my seat trying to remember everyone's name with Game of Thrones, where it's like, in Lord of the Rings,
you know who your heroes
Legolas. I'm ready for the Fellowship to do the things, and
And obviously, like, this can be a completely different episode unto itself. But obviously, with a bigger threat of death in Game of Thrones, you feel the stakes more.
Constant.
You feel like constantly, because truly, of the heroes that we establish in the Fellowship of the Ring, Boromir is the one who dies. That's it. That's it. Well, the entire rest of the Fellowship lives, except unless you're fooled by the Gandalf thing in the Fellowship. Right. And then obviously you literally watch the next movie or read the next book, and he's back.
Yeah, and even if someone does die, because Gandalf comes back, you're less concerned.
You're less concerned.
I thought that was it for the twins when they got carried away.
But absolutely.
Yeah, I was like, okay, there goes Boromir, and there goes them, and they're going to keep going on the river.
Yeah, no, and obviously that's a horrible thing there. And then obviously you have other characters who do die. They usually have like one per movie, like Haldir in Two Towers, which literally nobody cares.
Yeah,
he's just like this.
Haldir.
Exactly.
Yeah. Tolkien doesn't like to kill off his main characters, whereas Martin, he makes it very clear that anyone is.
Well, Martin makes it very clear that actions have consequences, and most of the deaths are because of something you did in the past led to your death.
And sometimes you're cheering for it.
Sometimes.
I did not. I was not a fan of Khaleesi's brother. I was like, he needs to go. No, when that whip guy got it, I'm like, that's it, bye, bro.
But it goes both ways. So not all the time in Game of Thrones, it's not always a bad decision that leads to your death. Sometimes it's because you wronged the wrong person. Yeah. You wronged a very powerful person, and even though you have goodwill and good.
Well, that's the other thing is just because you're good in Game of Thrones doesn't good. To the best extent of that word, just because you're good doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get punished for a bad decision you made.
Right. Yeah, and that could be death. That could be something way worse.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a messed up world. So but I like it. It's dark. It's good.
We kind of got off topic there on the cultures, but it was a little appropriate with just like how the cultures are portrayed there. Any other last minute things we really want to talk about with Lord of the Rings? Because obviously
Tolkien's pretty straightforward with his races and cultures, and it's really defined. The only people that you see that kind of leave that like center line of this is how the race works are like people that Gandalf approaches and says, "Do you want to go on an adventure? You can be different than all the other hobbits." Right? It's like besides those two characters and the Fellowship.
Yeah, because you have the hobbits who are just about that peaceful life. They don't want anything to do with outsiders. And then you just have the few outliers like Frodo and Bilbo, and then Frodo's companions.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest surprising moments is when the elves actually came to. That was the big battle with the
Helm's Deep.
Helm's Deep. So when the elves came, I was like, they actually can't. Like was still like a big
and that was a nice
movie
moment that obviously they just added in because the books didn't have that. The elves did not come. No. It was literally just the 300 against the 10,000 there. But it was a nice movie moment. I really enjoyed it because you have that whole psychic dialogue between Elrond and Galadriel of like, do we leave men to their fate or should we do something about this? And then obviously they send 200 elves, which I've done the math and I'm just like, the 200 elves literally by themselves, if every single shot they had comes in, like as long as they're taking out like 14 Oryx by themselves, that battle should have been over. Like,
I mean, but
obviously
they make elves out to be like super warriors.
Yeah,
so
but don't get me wrong.
Only runs out of arrows in The Hobbit, the final film of The Hobbit. That's the only time he runs out. He's like,
he's like, oh no!
Every time before that, he's got more. So I'm assuming elves have the similar thing. They always have more arrows.
But yeah. Yeah, we did kind of skip over Hobbits, so that was a good point to touch on there.
Yeah, the Hobbits are a pretty chill society.
Yeah. This one's just a little bit harder because there's a lot more different people groups in Game of Thrones that you can easily talk about their folklore, their culture, how they interact with other people. Lord of the Rings is just kind of straightforward, but Tolkien kind of set the standard for fantasy series with the archetypes of dwarves, men, and elves, and hobbits,
and the subsets that very few that appear.
Exactly.
And the treants and their society.
So yeah. I think that will do it for this one, guys. Yeah. So tune in next time, and we'll decide what we're going to do in between. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that bell, please.
Notification bell on!